Good morning. We welcome all of you to our class. Thank you so much for coming. We're moving through the whole Bible, starting with Genesis 1, and we've made it this far, chapter 9 of John. So if you will open your Bibles, if you bring your own, you can mark in them, of course. This weekend, Friday night, Saturday, we were going through all the things in my mother's house. She's never going to be able to live anywhere but an assisted living center again. And my brother and his wife were buying the old family farm from my mom. So anyway, we were going through all this stuff. And as we went through her Bibles, she was a big one for drawing lines and putting little asterisks and writing her set little notes and things. A couple of places I read she would read this again sometime, pay close attention to this one, this verse or whatever. So you can do that, of course, if it's your own Bible. If you didn't bring your own, then please do read the one on the back of the pew. Because educators remind us if more than one of your senses is involved in a learning exercise, it works all the better. So if your eyes are seeing what your ears are hearing, it'll mean all the more to you. So if you'll open to John chapter 9, in just a moment we will read. Our scholar we're using for this book is Dr. Gerard Sloyan. Dr. Sloyan, a very distinguished professor of New Testament studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. I've been trying to give you a wide range of different Christians. We've had Roman Catholic, we've had Episcopalian, we've had Disciple of Christ with Matthew just recently. So trying to give you a fairly wide range of experiences here and going through book after book. And I hope you're enjoying Dr. Sloyan's comments as we go along. Let me remind you, that will help you get into today's text, that the synoptics, if you're new with us, synoptics comes from Greek word. Optician we have, an optometrist and so on, has to do with seeing. So the S-Y-N on the front of the word is the same you have in synonym. And nomia in Greek means words or laws. It's another word for laws and words. So a synonym are two words that look alike. Look alike. So a synoptic means gospels that look alike, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now we've just been through those three, and you know they're not triplets. They are not identical, but they're much more like each other than John is like any of them. John's gospel is quite different. And one of the ways that they differ is, in the synoptics, we have only one trip that Jesus made to Jerusalem after he began his ministry. They don't say there were no other trips, but they just don't describe any other trips, just the one. And that was the one where, of course, he would be executed. In John's gospel, we have Jesus going again and again to Jerusalem. And at Passover is mentioned 3 different times, as in 3 different years. And that's where we get the idea that perhaps his ministry lasted 3 years, because John specifically mentions 3 times for Passover. But the text for today is not about Passover, it's about the Feast of Tabernacles, which occurs in the fall at harvest time. And I've told you that at the synagogue and at the temple, they will have a tent out there this fall that will remind them of their desert days under Moses' leadership, when God did lots of very important things for them and told them a lot, 10 Commandments, etc. So the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths, or your Jewish neighbors may call it Sukkoth, S-U-K-K-O-T-H, they may call it that, the Hebrew name for it. This event occurs when Jesus has gone to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, let's pray. God, we open this book knowing we need help in understanding. Parts of it are pretty clear to us, and other parts are more difficult for us. So we look to you, as we also look to people you've called to spend adult lifetimes focusing on 1 or 2 of the 66 books in your big book. We thank you for people like Dr. Sloyan, for their diligence, a 40-year adult lifetime, pouring as deeply as they know how into 1 of the 66 books. So help us understand and apply to the living of our lives what we are reading here. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, this chapter 9 is a very familiar story to you about a blind man. But before we get into the story itself, before we start to read, Dr. Sloyan, I think, needs to say a few things to us. And if you're new with us, let me remind you that I go through and read each of these commentaries, and then I just highlight the parts that I think are most relevant to you and me. Again, when these scholars finally do their life work that they've been involved in, they often write huge, big, fat books. And if you and I went together through each of those words, we would never get through with Revelation. We would not live long enough to get through. So that's why I edit down for you, and I try to find the parts that I think make it all hang together, but not giving you every little argument, rather getting to his conclusion, or her, when we have a woman scholar. Okay, so let's see what Dr. Sloyan says in introducing this study of the 9th chapter, and then we'll start to read. Jesus had come up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. And again, if you're new with us, let me remind you that the Bible always refers to going up to Jerusalem. They don't have the concept that you and I do, that up means going north, and down means going south, and over means east or west. Jerusalem, in Judea here, was up in elevation. And so when they went from Galilee on the lake, or came down the river road or the Mediterranean Sea road, they had to ascend more than 3,000 feet up into the hills of Jerusalem. So they always talk about going up to Jerusalem. And of course it also was a very significant place. Mount Moriah had the second temple after the first one, Solomon's, had been destroyed. The temple was rebuilt. And by the way, you see a lot of things that come out of the Middle East about the Bible and so on that are not reputable stories, like the bone boxes and so on of Jesus and his wife and all that sort of stuff. All the serious scholars said there's no validity to that whatsoever. But one of the really significant things the last few weeks has been the discovery, they believe, of King Herod's tomb. And excellent scholars are saying they believe they have it. King Herod had other palaces built. Isn't that what kings always do? One palace isn't nearly enough. You have to have as many as you can build. And so Herod did also. And one of those was called Herodium. And Herodium is where they believe they have finally found the burial place in the tomb of King Herod. Now, you and I think of hiss and boo when we hear Herod's name because of the killing of the infants when Jesus was born. But when you go to Israel, the Jews speak highly of King Herod because he built many beautiful things in addition to his own palace. And one of the things was he added on so much beauty, again, gold and silver and bronze and things, to the temple. The Romans destroyed it a second time in the year 70 of this common era, but that was about 74 or 5 years after Herod's death. Okay, Jesus had come up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. The various debates reported in these chapters we've just been dealing with are situated in Jerusalem, and specifically in the temple area. In a fitting symbolism, Jesus has declared himself to be the light of the world at the Feast of Tabernacles. He's also declared himself to be the living water, you recall, as they were going down 7 straight days, scooping up water from the pool of Siloam in a gold pitcher and going in procession, singing the psalms as they went back up on the Temple Mount and poured out the water onto very dry ground, asking God, please bring rain again, because this is at the end of 7 dry months. They normally have pretty good rainfall for 5 months, and then it stops. It doesn't rain for 7 months. So they did things in the early fall. The pagans did all kinds of rip-snorting things from orgies and back again, trying to inspire the gods to make rain. But the Jews took this very seriously and prayed to God that he would send rain. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles occurs in early autumn. And the reason we don't have a specific date, of course, is that Jews in their religious practice still use the lunar calendar, not the solar one. And so the lunar calendar on the 28-day cycle doesn't always fit with the Roman calendar, which has 30 and 31-day months. So that's why it changes from year to year, but it's always in early autumn. As this chapter 9 will unfold for us, it becomes clear that the man's sight is the spiritual seeing characteristic of this gospel. That is, not only does he not see animate objects, but is he seeing more than sighted people are seeing? And those who say they are not blind, Jesus says really are blind. So even though we're dealing with a man who does not see trees and camels and goats and sheep, and people who can see all those things, there's a deeper meaning here for John, and that is, but to see spiritually is the greatest gift one can possibly have. So blindness from birth is a contrast with the new vision, which is itself a second birth, or a rebirthing, as you have in chapter 3 in the discussion with Jesus and Nicodemus. You have to be born again. So he's been born once, blind. Everybody needs to be born a second time so that he or she sees with the soul, with the heart, and so on. That's what's at heart here. That's at the heart of what John's trying to tell you. The key verse, Dr. Sloyan begins, you can decide when we get there, is verse 39, he believes, where Jesus says, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Now, great delicacy is required in preaching on this chapter because the world of the first century was not alerted to the physically handicapped in the same way ours is. Using the blind and leprous as examples of the morally culpable or the spiritually insensitive may have been usual in those days. Today we consider it intolerable that one would be unkind or not thinking about people who are sick and ill. To imagine sending people who are leprous out to fend for themselves, that they're not supposed to get close to anybody they love ever again as long as they're leprous. They're supposed to stand way off the road and say, unclean, unclean, go away. All Dr. Sloyan is saying is that's not the way we would treat people today. We want the people who love AIDS victims most to be very close to them. People who have all kinds of illnesses, even tuberculosis and so on, that we're seeing more about right now. The people who are close to them. You may have to wear a mask. I was visiting a couple of patients this week that I had to put on gowns, rubber gloves, and so on before I could go over because they have an infection that I might could catch or I might could take down the hallway to somebody else. But they're not saying, don't be close. This person needs you to be close. Put on your gown, put on your rubber gloves. Sometimes we have to mask. This one didn't. It was a contact more than something you might breathe. But anyway, I'm simply saying that's what Sloyan's talking about. Today, we don't push the blind away. We don't push the lepers away. We don't push people even with contagious diseases away from all human contact. We want to be close to them while also exercising a proper caution in situations that call for it. So Jesus says early in this chapter, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. An indication that the evangelist, John, has his contemporaries in mind as the doers of works, not just Jesus. That is, when John writes his gospel a good 60 or 70 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, he has in mind we. We must do the works of him who sent him. But it's couched in present tense verb of Jesus saying, me, while he was still alive. Well, that's enough of that. Let's start reading. Chapter 9. I'm not going to read the whole story at first. We'll just take it in segments here as Dr. Sloyan suggests. Now, as Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, remember that simply means teacher, teacher who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And here this old feeling goes all the way back to the book of Job. If bad things are happening to you, you must have done something wrong. And when Job's 3 best friends supposedly come to him, they all say, now, Job, everybody else thinks you're a really nice person. We've thought you were a really nice person. What did you do wrong? So that your kids have been killed and all your animals are slaughtered and lost in a storm and everything. What would you do wrong? And I sometimes, when people are feeling pretty good at the hospital, I say they have guests, are these like the comforters of Job who come to see you today? To say, what'd you do wrong? How'd you mess up? Surely you wouldn't have been sick if you hadn't messed up somehow or other. So this was still a prevalent idea in Jesus' time. Here's a blind man. Who messed up? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed to him. We must work the works of him who sent me. And notice the first word in verse 4 is plural, and it is in Greek. We must. And then the pronoun in the middle of the sentence is singular, me. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. See, it has 3 syllables there. Your pronunciation guides marks them off. 3 syllables. The first I is the I is a long sound. The O is a long sound, and that middle syllable is the accented one. Siloam. Siloam is the word, which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. Remember, the word for able is dunamis, dunamai. The noun is power. The verb is to be able. Okay, let's see what Dr. Sloyan says. Jesus healed a man of his sightlessness in his lifetime, applying a mud paste to his eyes and doing so. John reiterates the claim that Jesus is the world's light. The community of believers enlightens a darkened world by its belief in Jesus. Now, Siloam, or sent, is the name of the pool, and here John refers to Jesus as the one sent to give light to the blind, both physically and spiritually as well. The response of Jesus to the question about the man's blindness is important in the search for a relation between human suffering and human causality. Jesus refuses to look for a culprit here. The man was born blind that the works of God might be made manifest in him, an answer reminiscent of the God who is working still, and I am working. We can conclude from sin to suffering, but not from suffering to sin. Let me say that again. We can make a conclusion that sin does bring suffering, but not that all suffering is caused by sin. God is greater than all suffering because God overcomes it in solidarity with our being made whole. The word salvation really is about making things whole again. God will overcome the man's impairment in a way and a time known only to God. Now, the deeds of him who sent me, about which Jesus speaks, are deeds of light, termed by one very well-known New Testament scholar, Schielenbeek, a Norwegian. Dr. Schielenbeek says this is the divine passivity, the positive of the divine. No one can work when night comes on. Night is the time of negativity. We work while there's day, while there's light. Let's go on a little farther. Verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar, because that's all blind people could do to stay alive, was beg, who had known him before as a beggar, began to ask, Is not this the man who used to sit and beg? Some were saying, it is he. Others were saying, no, but it's someone like him. He kept saying, I am the man. But they kept asking him, then how were your eyes opened? And he answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. Then I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, where is he now? He said, I don't know. Read a little farther. The witnesses are divided as to what has happened and to whom it happened. Familiar as they are with the man who's been cured, they don't know how to explain the results. So some conclude, well, this couldn't be the same man because the man we knew was blind. This man sees. Let's read a little farther. Verse 13. So they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. And here comes the ringer. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, "Well, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." And he said, "He is a prophet." Now notice as we go along through the telling of this story, that each time the man is asked, he elevates this person who's healed him. First he says, he was the man they called Jesus. Second time, he was a prophet. You hold on till we read what he says the next time they ask him the same questions. Now some of these Pharisees have a predictable scruples over healing somebody on the Sabbath. The inquiry shifts from how Jesus did the cure to who he really is. The blind man's first answer was he was a man named Jesus. Second, now he's a prophet. This had been the perception of the Samaritan woman at the well, do you remember? She thought he was a prophet because he seemed to know all about her. How many times she'd been married, and the guy she was living with now whom she had not bothered to marry. She had never seen this person in her life, yet he seemed to know all about her. He must be a prophet. Jesus is a prophet of deeds and words, like Elijah, like Elisha. Later in the chapter, the blind Sloyan goes on and gives it away here. Later in the chapter, he will be described as someone from God. And a little later, he will be called the Son of God. Let's read on in verse 18. The Jews, now here again, everybody there is a Jew. I hate to keep belaboring this, but you need to keep reminding yourself. John uses just the word for the Jews. But he doesn't mean all the Jews, because there's nobody else on that Temple Mount but Jews. And some of these people are going to be so loyal and faithful, best they know how, right through his death and resurrection. When he talks about the Jews here in Jerusalem, he's talking about the leadership. The Jews did not believe that the man had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. Stop and think. They are themselves Jews. They are not afraid of everybody up there on the hill that day. They're afraid of the authorities. The authorities are closely aligned with the Romans. The authorities among the Jews rule at the favor of the Romans. They can do what the Romans let them. They cannot do what the Romans will not let them. They're in cahoots with the Romans. And they know that the Romans think the only good Jew is a dead Jew. I mean, those, not all Romans in the empire, but the ones in control. Pontius Pilate is a bad, bad person. That's borne out in the history of the Roman Empire. Pontius Pilate was a bad man. Finally recalled even to the Caesar because he was such a bad man. And so all you had to do was breathe to Pilate or one of his officers, this person's disloyal, this person's treasonous, this person's whatever, and you die. So when they say the parents of the men were afraid of the Jews, it doesn't mean they're neighbors, they're relatives. It's the authorities. Okay? Probably going to tell you this all the way through the gospel, because Dr. Hank Knight was trying to tell you this in the 3 Sundays he had with you. You have to be really careful here and realize that when John uses this expression, he doesn't mean everybody, and everybody there is Jew. There are no Gentile followers of his at this point. Okay. His parents said this. We don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He's supposed to be 18 or older. He's of age. Ask him. He'll tell you. They were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed, and not all Jews, but a few, had agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Life centered in the synagogue. I remind you about Fiddler on the Roof. Old Tevye singing one of the biggest numbers in the show. I wish I were a rich man, that I didn't have to get up so early and milk these cows and hitch up the horse to the cart and deliver milk door to door to door before people's breakfast, before daylight, so that I can provide a proper dowry for five girls God gave me, 5 daughters, no sons. But notice how the song ends. If I were a rich man, I would go every day to the synagogue, and there I would talk. What is life? What is beauty? What is truth? What is meaning? I would go every day until somebody would one day say to me, Reb Tevye, Rabbi. They would look at me as a teacher. They would ask me, what is truth? What is beauty? What is meaning? What is purpose? Etc. To be put out of the synagogue was serious indeed. So if the Jewish authorities didn't turn you over to the Romans, they could bar you from participation. You couldn't be up at the Temple Mount. Couldn't be in the temple if they said you can't go. So it was serious. They didn't want to take a stand. Ask him. He's a grown man. Therefore his parents said, and John gives this to you again, he's of age. Ask him. Okay, let's stop and let Sloyan talk to you just a second. The man's parents are now summoned as witnesses. They refuse to give testimony about how he can see or who opened his eyes, and refer the questioners to their son, who is of age. Their affectation of total ignorance, meaning Sloyan doesn't think they're sincere by any means. They do know what happened. They know what Jesus did. They know something about who he was. They know what he's done. But they plead ignorance here. Conveys the fear within a family in the late first century of this common era when one of its members shows sympathy for the Jesus movement. What he's saying is, by the time John writes, it is no less difficult for those who follow Jesus. By the time John writes, the Jews of that next 2 generations have gone back to the synagogue, gone back to the temple's been destroyed by the Romans by this time. The synagogue is very important. And the followers of Jesus, so to speak, are being banished from the synagogues by this time. And so they're having a difficult time. The parents presumably know that anything which sounds like a faith statement from them, that Jesus might be the Messiah, will mean being rendered, and here the Greek word is apasynagogi, meaning apo, meaning you've been unsynagogued, if you would. You can't go to the synagogue. The Greek word is very clear. You don't get to go to the synagogue anymore. So they're very careful about what they're saying. The affirmation that Jesus is a prophet surfaced in verse 17. A spontaneous confession of awe at his power, like that of the woman at the well in Samaria. The title Christos, distincting of Jesus' Greek-speaking followers, and all that means is that Christ is the Greek word, or Christos is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. That's all. So when Christos is used more than Messiah, it means that probably these people are Greek-speaking. They may be Jews, may be Gentiles, but speaking Greek, not Hebrew. And all its connotations about that Greek word being used seems to make a lot of difference. In the Johannine, just the German word for John, in the Johannine milieu, in that period when those who had built a community of faith around John, one of those original 12, even though by this time of the writing he's long since been dead, but It was around him that they first had gathered. It was from him that they learned about the gospel. It was from him that they learned the stories about Jesus and what he had done next and so on. Okay. In the Johannine milieu, it is the watchword which invites vigorous reprisal. What? The word Christos. If you are a Jew and you're saying that Jesus is the Christos, it's the same as saying he's Messiah, and you're going to be ostracized by those who've gone back to the temple. The synagogues have gone back to the synagogues and are saying that Jesus was just a good man, a good prophet. It appears evident from the tenor of the dramatic expansion of verses 8 through 41 that we are no longer in the Jerusalem of Jesus' day, but in the tense Jewish quarter of some diaspora center. The lines have been drawn between the Jesus people and those who oppose them. Everyone concerned seems to be Jewish, but they are divided bitterly over the claims Jesus' disciples are making on his behalf. Believers in him are in a state of extreme vulnerability. Okay, let me just stop and help you with that again. Jews had scattered, for sure. They had been dispersed. But even in cities where they had gone, they usually had a neighborhood that was Jewish. They weren't always forced into these neighborhoods. It was some sense of security. If you go to big old American cities like Chicago, you have sections of the city called Little Italy, because Italians want to live close to other Italians. You have the Polish section of Chicago. You can have a German section in Chicago. You can have a Ukrainian section. You can certainly have Jewish sections. When I came back from Pittsburgh 3 years ago, when we Methodists had been in Pittsburgh for 2 weeks with our big general conference, I was telling Rabbi Charles Sherman how beautiful his hometown is. I was really impressed with Pittsburgh. The old steel mills are long since gone, and so there's not a huge smog hanging over the city, and where the two rivers come together and make the third, and the new stadiums and so on, beautiful trails along the rivers, and it's hilly, and there's a little cog railway that goes up, and nice restaurants and a beautiful Catholic church. So it's a beautiful city. And Rabbi Sherman said, well, I didn't know that. I didn't see that, because he lived in the Jewish section of Pittsburgh. Understand? As a boy, he grew up in the Jewish section, so that his neighbors are Jews. Now, what Dr. Sloyan is saying is that this community that had grown up around John and his life and his witness as to who Jesus of Nazareth really was, are wanting to live with the Jews. They want to be close to them. But if they talk about Jesus of Nazareth being the Christos, or the Messiah, the words both mean anointed one. Christos and Messiah mean anointed one. They're ostracized in some ways. So here John writes about the Jews, and he may be thinking about those who live in the city where they live, even though he writes about them as being in Jerusalem decades before. And I'm not saying that this event didn't occur. I'm not saying it didn't occur in Jerusalem. I'm not saying any of that, nor is Dr. Sloyan. What he's saying is that John's readers would hear it as referring to their own city. They would hear it as referring to what was happening then, right now. That's all we're saying. Okay, let's go to verse 24. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man," Jesus they mean, "is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see." Now, why did they say he was a sinner? Because he healed him on the Sabbath. He broke one of the 10 Commandments in their eyes. He healed him on the Sabbath. He's a sinner. Sinners can't do anything so wonderfully dramatic as causing a blind person to see. "I do not know whether he's a sinner. One thing I do know, though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" Does this sound like an investigating officer who just asks the same old questions over and over and over? If you watch these crime shows, ask the same question over and over and keep coming back to it, hoping to catch somebody in a discrepancy of one kind or another. Truth you can remember, lies you may get mixed up. He answered them, I've told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? That's not what they wanted to hear. Then they reviled him, saying, You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. And what this comes back to, remember, is, who is authentic revealer? Dr. Rudolf Bultmann, one of the great German theologians of the last century, now deceased, Dr. Bultmann's primary love in his academic life was John's Gospel. That was his book. And when I've told you, when finally his life work was published, a commentary on John, and then got translated into English and published in this country, the translator came across this expression, authentic revealer, so many times he just started putting capital A, capital R. That's what Bultmann saw in the Gospel of John. Who is the authentic revealer of God to you? And here in chapter 9, that's what's being debated. I told you when Rabbi Herman Schallman was here, and did such a marvelous job for us, he made very clear on Sunday morning that Moses was the principal revealer of God for him, for his faith community. Here it is again. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. Now remember that disciple means learner. So where are you looking for your instruction? Where are you looking for the one who teaches you? Are you looking to Moses? And remember, they all thought at that point Moses had written the Torah himself. That the first 5 books were written by Moses. So when they're talking about the person Moses, they're also talking about the scrolls that are most important to them. And even today, translations, new translations of the Torah. I've got one by Dr. Fox. Very fine rabbi. You know what he called it? The first 5 books of Moses. And when Dr. Hank Knight, we were having our last meeting with him, he's moved to New Hampshire, I'm sure you know. He's gone to teach and head up a department of Holocaust studies at a college in New Hampshire. But we wanted to give him a present. And Nancy Day said, I heard him talking about a new book. And I got the feeling that he didn't have it yet, so I'm going to get it for him, for the group. And if he's bought it, since I heard him say that, he can exchange it. And you know what this new translation is called? The 5 books of Moses. And yet, what I'm telling you is, today's scholars know Moses didn't really write the first 5 books. And Rabbi Sherman and Rabbi Fitcherman tell their congregation, he didn't write the first 5 books. But it's such an important part to them that Moses is the authentic revealer of God, and that the 5 scrolls, even if not written by Moses, are about Moses and the events of Moses' life. And they're also about Abraham and Sarah and so on, but Moses is the key figure, second only to God himself. So that's what's being debated here. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, because we have the Torah, you see. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. Remember, Nazareth was a real place, but it was so small and insignificant that they treated it as if, we don't know where that is. The man answered, Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. Now, what he's implying is that there may be people who've gone blind who could have their sight restored. If you got here that way, at this point, they don't believe, they don't know about any person who's ever been made to see if they were born blind. That's the point. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us? And they drove him out. So what happens to you? You get driven out of the synagogue, which was the place every good Jew wanted to be as often as possible. Now you can't go anymore. Okay, let's see what Sloyan says. The objectors, he uses that word instead of the Jews, whoever these folks are who are giving the healed men such a hard time, imply that Jesus cannot be devout or do God's will because he's not a disciple of Moses. That means a disciple on their terms, nor can anyone be sure of his origins. I mean, can anything good come out of Nazareth? But the believers in him retort through their spokesman, God has done the unheard of. He has given sight to a person blind from birth through this one you're calling a sinner. Jesus is to be believed in once he has been seen. So the vocabulary of this gospel says. And what that means is, if you don't see that God is present in Jesus, if you don't see that this is the Word made flesh, then you are blind. That's what John is contending here. Judgment is described as Jesus' work in the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who think they see really are made aware of their blindness. As everywhere in this Gospel of John, Jesus does not take the initiative in judgment so much as let people pass judgment on him, and by doing so, pass judgment on themselves. The Gospel writer is clearly of another mind. He does not disbelieve in Torah, nor does he think it unimportant in illumining the human scene or the nature of God, but he thinks it has been succeeded by the revealer of God who possesses and is himself the light of life. Jesus is the light that judges and saves the world, but he's also a blinding light, not to those who admit their blindness, for to these he gives sight, but to those who proclaim that they see, and in their boasting of having vision are shown to be truly blind. The problem of unjust suffering, as it is widely perceived, is of paramount importance to any one of us. Why do bad things happen to good people? The exchange back there in verses 2 and 3, on whose sin caused this man's blindness, once heard by congregations, may knock out any other hearing of this chapter. That's all we may hear. We mustn't stop there. We must go on. The paradox is that chapter 9 is both about human affliction, and it's not about human affliction. It's not about ordinary suffering or about God's injustice, since it ends fairly soon in a miraculous intervention, a matter outside the experience of almost anyone. John proposes that God's way is to transcend suffering by overcoming it at the level of belief in Jesus. Such belief in him is called sight, seeing what is truly there, whether blindness or other physical infirmity may continue. Paul had a thorn in the flesh that was never healed, and yet believed that in a deeper sense, his heart and mind in dealing with that affliction, whatever it was, had been healed. He wasn't asking God about it anymore. He was just moving on. John does not write about a flawless universe or about one that is shot through with miracle after miracle. He writes about the God who has sent his Son Jesus and rendered God eminently knowable through Jesus of Nazareth. We can know God if we know as much as we possibly can about his Son Jesus. Taking a stand on Jesus and on Jesus' relationship to God is by all means the matter at issue here. What needs to be examined is how Jesus, as Christos, anointed one, is the light of the world. It is the little blindnesses that cry out for examination, and these should be fearlessly explored. Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Asking the question is more than halfway to having the answer. You have seen him. It is he who speaks to you. And Jesus, who answered to the woman at the well, I who speak to you am. Or am He. The Jesus in whom faith is required reveals Himself and reveals God through Him in the word spoken to the community of faith. Following the truth as one perceives it, at whatever cost, is something which casual onlookers can never comprehend. The Gospels, all four of them, describe Jesus as knowing the Father's will, telling what He has seen, and dividing the world into those who see and those who choose to remain blind. The first tentative step in walking by the world's light, capital L for Jesus, while it is day, is walking by whatever light one has. As for this man, we do not know where he comes from. Where indeed is he from? John has made that clear in chapter 1 for us readers. Instead of, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, He began His work in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God, and nothing was made that was not made by the Word. The Word was in time made flesh, came and dwelt among us. He came unto His own received Him not. But to those who received Him, who believed in His name, the name for John is not Jesus. The name is the Christ, the Messiah. I believe you are the Messiah of God. Have life, have light, have life everlasting. Okay. The man says, whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I know, though I was blind, now I see. And that is the irrefutable logic of experience. It is the logic that people who are converts to any cause go on. I was there. It happened to me. What happens to persons who experience Jesus? In one sense, nothing. In another sense, everything. The God of light and truth reveals to them the fullness of deity itself in a human being. I think that's pretty clear. All right. Let's. Did we quit reading at verse 34? We did, didn't we? 35. Okay, let's read the last few verses, and then we'll be ready to move on to chapter 10. Jesus heard that they had driven the man out. Okay, he couldn't be at the synagogue, couldn't be at the temple, and when he found him, he asked him. I mean, he's concerned. This man had a wonderful thing happen to him. He could see, and now he's been put out of his community, if you will. Jesus is concerned, so he goes looking for him and says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him. And this expression, Son of Man, comes from the book that our scholars believe was probably the last one written and got in the Holy Writ of the Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel. Because you see, Daniel was placed earlier in the lineup by people who didn't know that Daniel was written very late. They thought it was written when Daniel lived during the Babylonian captivity, the Persian captivity. Scholars today believe that is not right. And the Jews, of course, knew that wasn't right. It was written at the time of Judas Maccabees, his brothers, Antiochus Epiphanes, the horrible persecutions about 150 years before Jesus came. And it's not telling you what's going to happen to Daniel. It's telling you what did happen to Daniel and all that had transpired since that time. Anyway, the book of Daniel, which many believe was the last of the 39 scrolls of the Hebrew Scriptures written, talks about the Son of Man, the Son of Man. People have finally come to believe that there are so many things in this life that are unfair, that bad things happen to very good people, and they are not restored to what they were in this lifetime. They do not get back everything in this lifetime, the way some later writer restored Job everything virtually he had lost before. They don't get back everything. Let me just put in a little plug here. The first Sunday night in July, 2 weeks away, July 1, we're going to celebrate part of our history here. We're going to have members of the History and Archives group help Dr. Kroll with the presentation at communion and so on that night. And then all who want to, we're going to get in our church vans and buses and so on and cars, and we're going to go to the first sites of the Boston Avenue Church. We're we're going to go and spend just a few minutes at each one of those sites, and then finally get back here, and we're going to have ice cream and so on for any who could come and be with us that long. All of this will take place before dark. That'll get dark at 9 o'clock. We'll have plenty of time to get this done. But we're going to be recounting some of the history, and one of the people who's going to speak is Roger Coffey. Roger Coffey has been chair of our building committee for more than 30 years, but his grandparents were Mr. and Mrs. C.C. Cole, Christopher Columbus Cole, and they were chairs of the building committee in 1927. They had a beautiful home right down here where Veterans Park is now. They had a beautiful home, they had a prosperous business, and they gave, and they pledged much. When this magnificent building was built, the people only had 1,600 members. About 400 people came on an average Sunday morning. 400 people built this building. And 6 months after it was opened for Easter 1929, the stock market crashed, and America went into the Great Depression. And Mr. and Mrs. Cole paid their pledge to the church by selling their beautiful home. They did. That's how much they believed in it, how much it changed their lives. And they were never restored in this lifetime. They never got back what they put into this church, money-wise. Never. They lived out the last years of their lives as very poor, commonly poor people here in Tulsa. Roger will tell you part of that story. It's in our history and archives. Roger just knows the story, as many of us know the story as well. So what I'm saying is that by the time of Judas Maccabees and his brothers, and by the time of this dreaded Antiochus Epiphanes, people had decided not all the wrongs of this lifetime get addressed in this lifetime. There must be a time and place where God makes all things right. When the Son of Man comes, it will happen. And so this is the discussion. I don't know this Son of Man. And so how does Jesus answer, of course? Well, you have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. He said, Lord. Lord translates the name given to Moses at the burning bush. Or it can simply mean one who's superior to you, your master. It doesn't have to be that name. The Greek word doesn't have to be that name, but it can be. He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. And here the word for worship is literally fall down on your knees, prostrate yourself in front of him. Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see, or think they do, may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, Surely we're not blind, are we? And Jesus said to them, If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, we see, your sin remains. You're not seeing it. You're not getting it. That's the point that he's trying to make. Let's see here. We don't have much time left today. Let's see if we can go up a little bit. Let's read a little bit farther in chapter 10. Okay? We've got 5 minutes. Chapter 10. Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger. They will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Now Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So again Jesus said to them, Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. Okay. Dr. Sloyan says there are two contrasts at work. One is between the shepherd and thieves and robbers, and the other between the shepherd and a stranger. Later in verse 5, the word becomes strangers, more than one. A minor character, the gatekeeper, seems to be some sub-shepherd of sorts, the one who's saying who gets in, who doesn't get in. The first story is one of peaceful entry, going in the gate, not at the gate, by a legitimate shepherd. The second one is of leading out by a stranger. Now, the stranger of verse 5 is probably a rustler in the vocabulary of the Old West, another who has no business leading a flock that's not his own. He will not be recognized by the sheep, and his voice will not be heeded. Is the distinction that John had in mind clear to us at this late date? Solian says, well, yes, it is to me, in the sense that we know that right faith in Jesus is the thing at issue throughout this fourth gospel. John's people possess it. The unidentified others against whom he is writing do not get it. At its narrowest, Johannine, that is, faith of this community that grew up around John after they fled Jerusalem, Johannine faith is faith in Jesus as the Word made flesh. From chapter 1. John disagrees strongly with the view abroad in his place and time that following Moses is incompatible with following Jesus. And we today, at Boston Avenue, believe we can believe with all our hearts in Torah. We can read the 39 scrolls of the Hebrew Scriptures and see in every one of them the Word of God. We don't believe you have to reject the 39 books in order to believe in Him who was the centerpiece of the next 27 books. There is truth, there is Word of God in both. Okay, both Old and New, both Hebrew Scripture and Christian. These readers are being challenged by John to see Jesus as the fulfillment of all that is given in the Torah. They should have recognized Jesus when He appeared because a sufficient number of witnesses, including God Himself, have already testified in Jesus' favor. He is the long-awaited Messiah of God. Well, we better stop there. Just put a mark, if you would, John chapter 10, verse 7, and we'll pick up there. Chapter 9 was a long one with 41 verses. Maybe we can move a little quicker when we get past here. Don't rush off if you haven't been to church yet. It's Father's Day.